to our February colloquium, everyone. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jason Cornell. And a little background on Jason. He completed his PhD at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in political science. And he was also an NSF fellow at Annenberg at the Neuroscience Messaging Lab with Emily Falk. And I think one of my favorite things, this little personal note about Dr. Cornell, is that before we came here, we had lunch with all the grad students, and I think it's really heartwarming to see a professor of his interests and skills really connect and ask genuine questions about all the grad students and make them feel like they really belong in our field. So thank you for that. And today he'll be talking to us on how does person-to-person communication transform political information, insights from social transmission, chains, and eye movements. Whew, a mouthful. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Shelby, for that introduction. So the first thing I want to say is thank you for inviting me to give this talk. It's actually my first time at MSU, and I've had a great time so far, and I look forward to your questions and suggestions at the end of this talk. So I am going to start this presentation by telling you a story of a political event that happened a few years ago. So there is currently a federal program where full-time congressional staffers can have up to $60,000 of their student loans repaid, right? A political commentator at a news show, in reference to this federal program, described it in the following way to his audience. So my wife Eileen just told me yesterday that staff in the House of Representatives and in the Senate do not pay student loans back. The government pays it for them. So what I want to highlight is that there's potentially two pieces of information that's missing here already that's could be quite important. So one is the specificity with respect to it only applies to full-time congressional staff. So you might think that it applies to everybody. And the fact that there's a $60,000 cap on it, right? So you might think without that information that they pay everything. So an audience member who saw this completely misunderstood this characterization further because they created an online petition referencing this program where now they're stating that children of Congress do not pay student loans, which is a complete distortion of what the federal program is actually about. So I'm using this example to highlight four important points. So the first one is the point that we often retell information to others, much like this political commentator's wife, and he to his audience. As a consequence, we actually receive a lot of secondhand information in our everyday lives, much like that political commentator didn't know anything about that federal program except from the information that was provided by his wife. And as highlighted by this example, retelling information creates an opportunity for distortions to occur. And so ultimately, information after person-to-person transmission is going to look very different at the end of it from its original version, right? Thinking back to what it looked like in actuality to what it ended up being as reflected in the online kind of poll. So despite the ubiquity of person-to-person transmission, a lot of work in political communication doesn't actually look at how political information is transformed as it moves through person-to-person transmission. And so the work that I'm going to present today, and largely the focus of my research, specifically examines how political messages, how political information gets dynamically transformed as they pass through social transmission. So in terms of what I view as to just give you kind of a big picture background of how this work contributes to the literature, a lot of the existing models and influential models in politics that deal with social transmission focus on the strategic aspects of it, So what do I mean by that? That senders, for the most part, have a motive to persuade, that they are going to act strategically over the course of social transmission. And so the way this body of work would explain why information changes across social transmission is it's because people are intentionally misrepresenting information because they have strategic motives. It's in their strategic interest to do so. And so what I'm going to do with the studies I'm going to show you is raise the possibility of non-strategic explanations. So in particular, I am going to show you a series of proof of concept studies showing how person-to-person transmission can create misinformation, and it's going to do so in the absence of strategic behaviors on the part of the senders, and it's going to occur largely because of biases in memory. So the argument of the whole talk is actually pretty straightforward. It's just that person-to-person transmission can change political information, and that biases in memory in part can explain why person-to-person transmission changes political information. I mean, this is the core of the entire talk. The studies that I'm going to present to you is just, in one way or another, is just saying the same thing, but just in different ways. So the specific question that I'm answering is, how does person-to-person transmission create numerical information? And I'm going to present 3 studies. The first 2 deal directly with person-to-person transmission, and then the final study is an eye tracking study that gets more at the cognitive, individual level cognitive mechanisms. All right? So a bit of a background about numerical information. So numerical facts play a very prominent role in public discourse. By numerical facts, I mean things like population demographics, economic statistics, public opinion data about what percentage of Americans support or oppose certain things. And there's growing recognition that it's important for voters to possess accurate knowledge of them. Why? Because political elites, like politicians, interest groups, journalists, use them to argue for or fight against certain policies. So for example, here is an instance of Trump using numerical information to advocate for his policy preferences with respect to immigration. But what we often find is that people are misinformed about things like population demographics, economic statistics, and just other quantities related to politics. Why is that? So one mechanism that I'm going to suggest is one way they can be misinformed is through their schemas. So what do I mean by schemas? By schemas, I'm just generally talking about people's pre-existing knowledge about the world. If you want a good example, stereotypes are a good example of general cultural schemas. And there's a large body of work in psychology showing that schemas can cause distortions in memory. In particular, information can be misremembered in a way that is consistent with your schema. So here's an example. So as a matter of fact, the number of Mexican immigrants from 2007 to 2014 has actually decreased. By this, I mean both documented and undocumented. But people may have a schema that the number keeps increasing every year. So despite exposure to, let's say, the factually accurate information, at a later time point, they may still misremember it in a way that fits with their schema. How would that happen? So whenever you remember a past event, you basically have to reconstruct that event from memory. A lot of people have this view that remembering is like a video recorder. You record something, and then whenever you have to remember something, you just press a play button. That's actually probably not the way you should be thinking about it. It's actually closer to a jigsaw puzzle, that whenever you're trying to remember something, you're trying to reconstruct the pieces every time. And it's during this reconstruction process where schemas can exert an effect. So for instance, you may remember the numbers that I showed you, 11.7 million and 12.8 million, but reconstruct it in a way that comports with your schema, suggesting that the number of Mexican immigrants is increasing every year. So this in some ways could get worse when you consider person-to-person transmission, because whenever you have to retell something, you have to reconstruct it from memory. And in person-to-person transmission, there's just a ton of instances where you have a ton of reconstruction and a ton of instances for schemas to distort the memory. So the more specific question that I'm answering for this particular study is what will happen to schema inconsistent numerical information over the course of person-to-person transmission. So similar to the factually accurate, let's say, at least for some people, Mexican immigration example that I showed. So in terms of the core hypothesis of the study, person-to-person transmission will transform schema inconsistent information such that it becomes consistent with people's schemas. Because again, there's plenty of opportunities where people are retelling information. If you have to retell a past event, you have to reconstruct it from memory. If you're reconstructing it from memory, those are the opportunities for schemas to come in and distort your reconstruction. So the stimuli are actually similar across the three studies that I'm going to show you, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about them. So what we first had to do was identify political issues where many people shared similar schemas about numerical information. So based on pre-tests, we identified two issues where the factually accurate information was consistent with people's schemas, and then two issues where the factually accurate information was inconsistent with people's schemas. And I'm going to go through what these issues are. So in terms of the schema inconsistent information, the first one, as I've told you already, is the number of Mexican immigrants in the US. So in terms of the actual numbers from 2007 to 2014, it has decreased. But according to our pretest, if you just ask people to estimate what were the number in 2007, what were the number in 2014, the average estimates indicates an increase. All right. The other one is the number of individuals shot and killed by police by race in 2016. So in terms of the actual ones, in terms of raw numbers, there were more whites than blacks. To contextualize this, however, keep in mind that African Americans are about 12 to 13% of the population, but they're 25% here. So they're still overrepresented as in terms of the number of individuals shot and killed. So in terms of the estimates of our pretest participants, it's the opposite pattern. All right, so that's the schema inconsistent information. What about the schema consistent information? So for this issue, percentage of Americans who prefer a male or female boss. In terms of public opinion data, the actual estimate seems to be more Americans prefer a male than a female boss. And if you ask the pretest participants to estimate how many Americans do you think prefer a male boss, how many Americans do you think prefer a female boss, it's in line in terms of their belief that most Americans would prefer a male than a female boss. And then finally, estimating the percentage of support of Americans for same-sex marriage. In terms of the actual data, more people support than oppose. And if you asked pretest participants to estimate it, it's in the same direction. All right, so the first study was an MTurk study with 300 participants. And what they basically had to do was read 20 short paragraphs, which we referred to as blog posts. 16 were basically just distractor stimuli. The 4 were the critical ones, which is conveying information about the 4 that I just showed you. So here's an example of the schema inconsistent information for the issue of immigration. So it says in 2007, 12.8 million Mexican immigrants lived in the United States. In 2014, 11.7 million Mexican immigrants lived in the US. So after reading the 20 paragraphs, they were given an open-ended recall test on each of the 4 issues. So the way it worked was something like this, where they were explicitly asked, according to one of the blog posts, how many millions of Mexican immigrants lived in the US in 2007? According to one of the blog posts, how many millions of Mexican immigrants lived in the US in 2014? So the thing to keep in mind is that this is specifically asking them for their memory of what we showed them. It's not asking them, what do you think the numbers should be? So this study uses actually a very old paradigm in psychology called the serial reproduction paradigm. So the quickest way to explain it, I'll go into further depth, but it's basically like the game of telephone, right? Where you just, it's a kid's game where you line up a series of kids. The first person in the line whispers a message to the second person, who then whispers the message to the second person, and so on. And the way this particular study is designed, it's designed to isolate the specific role of memory in person-to-person transmission. So the 300 participants were organized into 100 three-person chains. So what do I mean by this? So here's an example of a single three-person chain. So the first person in the chain, right, get exposed to the stimuli, and then they're given a memory test. So whatever number they write in, that number now gets passed on to the second person in the chain. So the text is the same that the second person will see. The thing that's only changing is the numbers. The numbers will now be based on what the first person wrote. The first person just sees the original version of the stimuli, right? And so the second person will do the same thing, and whatever number they wrote from memory gets passed on to the third person. When I say that this paradigm is designed to isolate the specific role of memory, this is what I mean. By design, and this was intentionally done, they were not told that the information was going to get passed on to somebody else. That was important because that was our way of removing strategic considerations from the process. Since this is going to be a proof of concept study, just showing that these memory distortions is what's driving the creation of misinformation. So this is, right, so this is one of 100 three-person chains where, so just a little bit of terminology, your place in the chain is just designated by wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, and there's 100 different individuals in each wave. So again, to remind you, our core hypothesis is that person-to-person transmission will transform schema-inconsistent information such that it becomes consistent with people's schemas. All right, so now, yes?
So the third person, they're just asked to remember. Does that third person know that the third person in a chain?
No, they know.
They don't. They're just asked to repeat.
They have no knowledge at all that they're part of some social, that they're getting information from another participant.
Okay, and they're told to just remember what they saw.
Yes.
From okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So here are the results. So on the x-axis, I'm going to show you the waves, like the data broken down by waves. On the y-axis, what you'll see is the average numerical estimates from the individuals per wave, right? So the initial values were the factually accurate starting values that the wave 1 people saw, right? So in this case, the black dot is the number of Mexican immigrants in 2007, and then the diamond for 2014. And there were more in 2007 than in 2014. All right, so by wave 1, you already kind of get a reversal in terms of what people remember, meaning that their average estimate for 2014 is larger than the one in 2007. By wave 2, that gap has just increased. And then by wave 3, that gap has further increased. So to just give you a sense, the difference between these two averages is about 900,000 in wave 1, and it's about 4.1 million in wave 3. Part of what we think is what's driving this increase in gap is that it's easier for people to remember schema-consistent information. So for instance, if I make a mistake and I say something like, oh, in 2007 there were 10 million, and then in 2014 there were 30 million, that's going to be much more likely remembered by the other person who was getting it. All right, so now I'm going to show you the data on number of individuals shot and killed by police in 2016. So again, in terms of just raw numbers, more white than black. In wave 1, you don't get the cross yet, but the gap has decreased. By wave 2, you're almost getting the cross, and by wave 3, you get the full reversal. All right, so what about the schema consistent information? So this is actually a pretty critical comparison because you should not expect the flip to happen since they're already, at least the initial incoming information are already consistent with people's schemas, all right? So I'll start with a percentage of Americans who prefer a male or a female boss with more male than female. By wave 1, you maintain that relationship. By wave 2, you maintain that relationship. And by wave 3, you still maintain that relationship. All right, next, percentage of Americans who favor or oppose same-sex marriage, more favor than oppose. By wave 1, you maintain this schematically consistent relationship. By wave 2, it's maintained. And by wave 3, it's still maintained. All right? So in terms of a global summary for study 1, person-to-person transmission will transform schema inconsistent information to schema consistent numerical information. And critically, it's doing so in the absence of strategic considerations on the part of the participants, since they don't even know that what they're writing down is being transmitted to somebody else. So a question that you may ask, which we certainly did, is, are these results robust? In particular, can we obtain similar results with an easier memory test? So that's the point of study 2. So this one is using now a completely different sample, research match, which is a participant registry initially started by the NIH. It is similar to study 1, except that it uses a different memory test. So it's using a queued recall with number sliders. So what do I mean by that? So instead of an open-ended box where they can just put whatever number they wanted, it's actually bounded now, let's say in the issue of Mexican immigration, in this case by 25 million. So it's almost acting as like a reminder that whatever we showed you was below 25 million. So you shouldn't enter anything above 25 million. So it's easier in that sense. So it used the same serial reproduction paradigm. So again, 100 different 3-person chains. So here are the results. Again, starting with the Mexican immigration issue. By wave 1, similar to study 1, you get the flip already. Wave 2, that flip has increased. Wave 3, that flip has increased. What you'll notice is that the gap isn't as big as wave 1, and that's because there's an upper bound to what they could enter. So next, number of individuals shot and killed by police. By wave 1, similar again to study 1, it decreased, but you don't get the crossover. Wave 2, you basically get the crossover. Wave 3, you get the full crossover. Now moving on to the schema consistent issue. Americans who prefer a male or female boss. Wave 1, maintain the relationship. Wave 2, maintains the relationship. Wave 3, maintains the relationship. Finally, opposition or support to same-sex marriage. Wave 1 maintains the relationship. Wave 2 maintains the relationship. Wave 3 maintains the relationship. So as a final summary for the 2 studies, again, person-to-person transmission will transform schema inconsistent to schema consistent numerical information. And the effects are robust across different samples and also different memory tasks. And again, across both studies, strategic considerations are not in play. Because again, they don't know that information is being transmitted to another person. So now, in the final study, I'm going to zoom in more at the individual mechanisms of what are some of the individual mechanisms leading to why people misremember. So there is a quote-unquote, non-memory-based alternative explanation for these results. So the strong version of this claim is that people didn't really pay attention to the critical stimuli. There's a lot of them. There was 20. And therefore, they actually had no memory for what they were shown. So the responses they were giving were just pure guesses. So the guesses were still based on their schemas, but it wasn't being constructed based on the material or information that we provided them. So for this study, we recruited 110 participants. This was a community sample, and we monitored their eyes as they were reading the stimuli. So that's the eye tracking device. It's a kind of a cartoonish representation, but the basic idea is it shines a very low level infrared light into your eyes, and you can use that information to track what people are looking at on the screen. What's critical is that there are eye tracking studies basically showing that people reread texts that violate their expectations. So you can make inferences from that and predictions as to what people would do when they're reading schema consistent and schema inconsistent information, right? That you would expect them to reread text a lot more if they're being shown schema inconsistent information than schema consistent information, if they're paying attention to what they're being presented. If they're not paying attention, that there shouldn't be no difference in their rereading across those two different types of stimuli. So unlike the two studies, we, for this one, were able to create a schema consistent and inconsistent version for each issue, right? And what you would do is you would just flip the numbers around, as in this case, right? Where the schema inconsistent version shows the number of Mexican immigrants decreasing, and then the consistent one increasing, and then half the participants got the first version and the other half got the second version. So now I'm going to show you what kind of an example of what the eye movements will look like. All right. So when I hit play, that red dot is going to start moving across the screen. That's going to tell you what the participants are looking at. And so I highlighted in red the numbers. So here's an example of what this particular participant's eye movement patterns look like when they're reading schema consistent information, in this case showing that the number of Mexican immigrants has increased. All right. Now I'm going to show you data from another participant showing what their eye movement patterns look like when they're reading schema inconsistent information for the same issue. So this one is showing that the number of Mexican immigrants has decreased across this time period. All right, so here is a different way of looking at the data, a different representation. So the red lines are the trajectory of the eye movements. The circles, the blue circles, are basically fixation, so points when their gaze are stopped at a particular location in their visual field. And then the size of the circles represent how long they're looking at something, right? So across the board, we operationalize rereading in 3 different ways. The results are consistent across all 3, but one way that you can operationalize it is the number of times they read back to the first number the moment they hit the second number. Because they're not going to realize that this thing violates their expectation until they have information about what the second number is. And so overall, you get more regressions to the first number in the inconsistent than the consistent condition. We also assess their memory performance in two very important ways. So this one is similar to study one, in which it's an open-ended recall test. And so one measure of accuracy that we used was whether they correctly remembered which number was larger based on what they inputted. So in this case, we didn't care whether or not, they put in 5 million for 2007 or 30 million for 2014. It was agnostic to that. It was just, did they have a sense, a gist, like memory representation of which number was larger? And what we found is that they're much more likely to be accurate when they were presented with schema consistent than schema inconsistent information. The other important memory assessment we did was their memory now for the individual numeric items. So meaning that if we showed you 11.7 million, were you actually able to remember something that was around 11.7 million, right? And what you found here is that there was actually no difference, statistical difference between the schema consistent and inconsistent conditions, that they remembered almost like a super majority of the individual level numeric items. So what does this mean? Well, overall, people seem to possess memory for the numerical items, but our kind of working hypothesis right now is that when they reconstructed the relationships, like, well, which number was associated with 2007 and then which one was in 2014, they were doing it in a way that comported with their schema. So, like I promised you, the main argument and the main points is just pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. So 2 points, that person-to-person transmission can change political information, and that biases in memory can in part explain why these changes are occurring. So in terms of the broader implications of this work, I view it as this. So there's a lot of both academic and you could say kind of popular focus on strategic sources of misinformation, like disinformation campaigns, Fox News, not to mention the types of like game theoretic models that assume that agents act strategically to spread misinformation. I think those explanations are actually very important. I think the behavior of political elites, like politicians and interest groups, I think for the most part they're acting strategically. But what I want to raise is that it's also important to consider non-strategic explanations, because I think that for certain large segments of the electorate, like political novices who don't really care that much about politics and who only talk about politics in passing with other people who might not be interested in politics that much as well, non-strategic explanations like memory biases are going to play a bigger role. So I'm going to end by just telling you a little bit of the current and future directions of this line of work. So what I just showed you were the initial proof of concept studies. The studies that we're doing now and that we plan to do are adding now layers of complexity on top of the model. So for instance, one work that we just had published is now looking at, this is work done in the substantive domain of competitive frames. It's looking at now how the entire message is being transformed, which is more complicated by person-to-person transmission, right? Because in the studies that I showed you, what's just being transformed are two numerical values. But in this case, it's like an entire text that's being transformed. We're also doing work in a domain outside of politics, so person-to-person transmission of science information and what happens with that. And then work that we just finished data collection on that we're currently analyzing. This is with Aaron Druin, a graduate student at OSU. We're actually bringing strategic considerations back in and looking at how that interacts with memory biases in the transmission of gender political stereotypes. So the interesting thing with that, what we expect to happen is that your gender stereotypes about political candidates will influence what you remember from them. And then based on what you remember from them, you are now going to strategically pick what you convey to other people. Because in this study, people now know that whatever they pick is going to be seen by somebody else. And I think that's probably where the future of this work is going to go, where it's looking at the interaction of both non-strategic and strategic reasons in the selection and transmission of political information. So I need to acknowledge the group of graduate students and undergraduate students who helped with this line of work. They are at OSU. Here they are. I think some of them might be watching the live stream, so they can see their faces. And I wanted to thank you guys. Thank you. Yes.
So on the schema inconsistent examples, there must have been some variance around the estimates.
Yes, so that is one potential limitation of this study, is that we did not measure individual level schema.
Right.
What we were going for, and that was why we did the pretest, was to try and identify ones that more or less at the group level, most people would share like a similar schema.
So it's not really a pretest, right? It's a pilot test then. They weren't the
Yes,
same
yes.
people. You didn't get the baselines.
Yes.
Thank you.
It was a pilot test, yes.
So, but there was some variance there, and so it might be the case if you're sitting in the second seat, if it's not really schema inconsistent for you, your response to that first seat estimate could be substantially different from somebody who, for whom it is really schema inconsistent.
But that was randomly assigned though, right? So their location in the...
Regardless, it's still the case that if you're individually different on whether it's really schema inconsistent, your pattern could be very different. Now, the reason I bring it up is that actually, if that's the case, then your results are probably less striking than they ordinarily would be.
I would say that my estimates are actually an underestimate, because keep it...
That's what he said.
Yeah, that's
What
what.
you say.
He said
But-
you've attenuated the results.
Right. Right. That feeds into my... Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Okay. So I have a question about the, not question, just I want to ask your opinions about it. So your study 3 results suggest that people do remember the numeracy,
Yes.
but they do have a problem to reconstruct the memory, like having problem to reconstruct that relationship between the numerical values. So I wonder if the result would change if you display your information in the visual, using the visualization information like graph or pie chart, because I assume that when the information is displayed using the numeracy value, it may requires more cognitive level for the individuals to understand that to match the numeracy with the specific target of the information, but rather than just seeing that what is bigger number than the other.
So thank you for asking that question, because we are actually running a study that presents, that changed the mode of presentation, given, as you said, there is evidence that people are better able to remember when you present it in this particular version of the study that we're doing, it's bar graphs. So we'll get to see whether it improves it. I doubt that, so the trick with this thing, right, is if you stay within this framework of that this information is being passed down a series of chains, I think the number of chains is actually, like the length of the chain is going to matter a lot, in a sense that I think the longer it is, the more errors that you're going to get. And I think that it might, changing modality might slow it down, might slow the rate of errors. But I don't think it's going to remove it completely, especially if you extend like the number of chains to something like 10 or 20. Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Nancy. Well, I'm very interested in everything you presented, so thank you so much. But I want to push it a little bit because I really don't see the communication here. I see person-to-person modal or person-to-person transmission, but they don't even really know that it was a transmission from another person or that they're sending it to another. And then, so that's kind of to extend that out to get more communication oriented there. But then what happens with interpersonal communication? Because if you really were transmitting this fact to somebody, now maybe not if it's a political commentator, but you have a chance for somebody to interact with you.
Yep.
And so how does all that mess
Okay.
everything up and get a lot more
Yes.
complex?
So I think you made 2 points. I'm going to answer the first point. So by design, that was intentional to, again, like remove this communication element that people knew what they were, that the information was going to be transmitted to somebody else, because I think the goal of the study was to just say, as a theoretical possibility,
Well, I
it's...
understood all that. I was just saying now, moving forward, I'm asking you a question about how does this move forward so that
Yes.
it really embodies communication?
So we're actually doing, he's a graduate student now, Ryan Moore, where we use the same stimuli where it's now a collaborative remembering paradigm. So it's 2 people that's actually trying to jointly remember the information that they were presented. And what you get is a general improvement in memory accuracy. And so we're analyzing, so something that hasn't been done that much in the collaborative remembering paradigm is we recorded the discussions and we did content analysis on the discussions. And what you find so far, I mean, the data is not finalized, but one of the best predictors of whether the group will remember it accurately is whether the other person is scrutinizing the other one, saying like, I don't think that's what it is. And so when you begin adding in layers like two-way communication, like as that study indicates, you could potentially decrease the power of these schemas to cause misremembering. Yes, Ron.
Yeah, I was wondering, could you do me a favor and go back to that, the slides for the first 2 inconsistent set of wave observations? Now, I have a question about, kind of deals with your definition of schema. The graphs that were, not the ones that showed the crossovers, the first 2? Yeah,
So study one?
Inconsistent in study 1, yes.
Okay.
So if you look at the first one, right, the first inconsistent pattern, it crosses over immediately, but then the waves 2 and 3, you see actually an increase in the 2017 estimate, right? And if you look at the second one shows that even after the first wave, the predicted pattern continues it continues to go down in the one you expect to go down. What I found interesting about this has to do with and when you first talked about what their schema was and your representation of schema, you represented it numerically in terms of what these numbers are. Yeah. But you could also think of schema inconsistency in terms of being inconsistent with your opinion about this matter. So, for example, I'm speculating here, but I might expect that a lot of people who look at immigration numbers like this, especially, I don't know, where did you do your study? Were they students?
That was MTurk, right?
The study
Was
one was
MTurk?
MTurk,
Okay,
yes.
then if you have a national, representative sample, maybe it's not as much the case, but when I think a lot of the people who think of immigration, I would think that they might think that the numbers are, have increased, but they might not think it's a problem, okay? On the other hand, when I think of the number of black or white people shot by police officers, they might think that more black, victims are shot, and probably most people do think that's a problem, right? So in that instance, we see the definition of schema inconsistency change, don't we? So in the first case here, this might be inconsistent with the numbers, but it might not be inconsistent with because they don't see it as a problem, right? So after the first wave, you don't see the continued drop. Perhaps because you don't see it as a problem, and that the impact on recall with regard to inconsistency might have as much to do with whether or not you think it is, it's a problem in terms of just whether or not this is consistent or inconsistent with your memory of some numerical representation. Does that make sense at all?
Yes. So I think the best way that we could try to answer that question using the data that we have, because again, we didn't ask them for their individual opinion as to whether, for instance, they think this is a problem or not, is their partisanship, right? Because you could expect, you could make certain predictions as to whether Republicans or Democrats are going to go a certain way. It's not a complete individual level measure, but it's a rough estimate. So we did do analyses on study one because it was the cleanest in terms of being able to have multiple versions of interacting their partisanship with schema consistency and seeing whether it predicted memory. Now, this was exploratory analyses, and this was not something that we set out to do, but we didn't find any significant relationships with party ID.
You see what I'm saying here? After wave one, this pattern is the same as the schema consistent pattern, right? And what I'm saying is that maybe that's because after wave one, the numbers are consistent with what they think the problem, with whether or not they think is a problem.
Oh, I see.
You see?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
But in the second example, with the the number of black or white victims, no, it's not consistent anymore, right? Because this is a problem to me.
Could you put that next one in? Thank you. I can't remember it.
So this one.
Yeah.
Just become consistent.
That's what how much stuff you did like wave four
Right.
with study one.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because then it's still validating what.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying that how you define schema consistency here.
Yes. I see what you're saying. Yes. So I think to be precise, schema consistency only applies to the initial, yes.
But the people looking at it.
Yes, I agree, yes.
It might, how they are in terms of what their schema is and how it should affect their recall and retransmission might have more to do with their opinion of the issue than the numerical representation.
Could be, but I mean,
Because my guess is that people for the first issue don't see it as that gap between. They just think the problem for them is that there are too many immigrants, not that it's going up or down. And whether it's going up or down probably doesn't make as much difference to them as it does here.
Yeah.
That's purely speculative, so you can ignore me. I just was.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, I see two possible confounds, and I'm saying this lovingly because it's Valentine's Day. And the schema inconsistent claims. Because if we go back, okay, let's stay here. I mean, starting with Trayvon Martin and Ferguson, and what there have been about black men and women that have been killed at the hands of the police. Those have been covered heavily in the news, and the impact of that. I mean, when a white guy gets killed by the police, maybe less how that is contributing to the schema, the whole heaviness of that news coverage. So that's a problem I see there. And if you go back to the Mexican slide, you know, the immigrants now are Latinx immigrants from Central America. They are not Mexican, and I don't know what the statistics are with Pew, but I see your participants in IMTER conflating Mexican immigrants and Central American immigrants, and in fact, it may indeed be schema consistent that the number of Latinx immigrants are increasing. So I think potentially your participants are conflating. You know, they don't distinguish between Mexican and Honduran and Guatemalan, and in fact, the number of Central American immigrants coming to the United States at the southwest borders, whether they're legal or illegal.
Well, Mary, you gave them the numbers.
What's that?
He gave them the numbers, though.
Yeah.
And
Oh, I see.
they walked away
Okay.
from that treatment with the incorrect interpretation.
Yeah, but their schema still might be based upon
I
the
see.
reality of Latinx immigration, which is not, you know, Mexican, in fact, immigration has decreased, but
So that.
Latinx
so they
immigration
keep the
may,
schema
and so they're
consistent.
conflating, right, and that's what I'm saying, that this trajectory that you have here could indeed be, if they are conflating Latino, Latinx immigrants together and not distinguishing Mexican from the large number, you know, I hope you see my point.
No, I do.
Right, so news coverage in the case, news coverage of black killings, right, there are more white guys in jail, in prison, than there are black. That's an established figure. Similarly, you know, more white men are killed by police than black. But the news coverage is very heavy for, you know, for that. And I wonder to what extent that, and maybe that goes back to what Frank asked you about, you know, individual differences, and maybe you need to measure that. But I think here, though, this is really problematic.
But I think, though, with respect to the Mexican immigration issue, in terms of the studies that have done content analyses of how immigration is covered, like that term is usually associated with Mexican, and it's actually usually associated with illegal. Like these three concepts, at least in the news environment, are all paired together. And so if we're going to, you know, assume that schemas are formed based on repeated exposures of what you actually get exposed to in this environment, what I would actually say is that they're probably assuming that the data I presented to them, that they were thinking not only just Mexican, but like illegal Mexican immigrants.
I just say they're conflating it because I think the facts are wrong there.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that if you look at Pew for who is immigrating from south of the border to the United States, you're going to find that Central American, Latinx immigrants trump. Sorry about that. Mexican, you know. So anyway, that I think maybe your participants are potentially could be conflating, you know, with the reality of what is around them. You know. So anyway, I just suggest that.
And, mine's a little. I'm just interested in why the patterns are different in the first two. That's really what I'm interested in.
I mean, there's a lot of potential differences, right? So, for instance, at least in the open-ended version, there are even methodological measurement issues, which is, this one is unbounded, whereas the other one is capped at 963, right? Which I would guess that in part explains or could explain why the separation between the two values are slower in the second one versus, than this one.
Let me add what Frank said. Frank said this is the one that's consistent with your hypothesis, and that the next one is actually the one that's inconsistent with your hypothesis, because once it's crossed over, it's now consistent. It's no longer an inconsistent schema, it's a consistent schema. So then you would ask, well, why does that one, you know, why does the increase continue, right? And I think I should put words in your mouth.
Although, could I see the other slide too, please? Okay, do you know for sure that that decrease, the one that we showed previously, that those two slopes really differ from each other? Could that be sampling error? I mean, it may be the case that those two do replicate if you compare the two slopes.
Did we actually, we did run, you mean study 1 and study 2?
Yeah.
Or you mean-
The immigration issue and the shooting issue.
It's hard to
Right.
compare because they're different scales,
Well, yeah, but,
right?
yeah, that's true.
Is there a chance to ask a question as well? Maybe, yeah, I'd just let go. You said that the schema are dependent on the exposure, numbers of exposures to certain kind of, relation, actually. You have a comparative data set here, so you have which is bigger than the other. It's not just numbers, it's
Yes.
just the crossover is the point where things happen, because there the qualitative step occurs, because now the one that is not bigger is supposed to be bigger, right?
Right.
So it's just flipping. So, but schema also have some other kind of, I would say, workload. How salient are they for your daily communication, for how you see the world? So I just was wondering about why this crossover happens later. So it's all about the crossover. But if this crossover happens later, then the salience of the schema might be different from the other schema. So where you more deliberately give into the error. Is this an opportunity? Is this a possibility or not?
So the saliency of the issues was definitely something that we factored into the stimuli selection, right? And so, as you'll kind of notice, arguably the 4 issues are all high salience issues, because by design what we wanted to do was pick issues where people had very strong schematic expectations as to what the direction of, let's say, the numbers was going to be. Now, in terms of what you're asking as to whether the police shooting issue is more salient than the Mexican immigration issue, that we don't have cross kind of issue comparisons. We did try to, we actually wanted a form of a control condition here, which is an issue that, people generally have no schemas about. Like, what would that look like? What we actually found was that was very difficult to find. We couldn't find one, especially one that would be equated in terms of saliency with these 4 issues, so that saliency is not a confound.
Maybe salience is the wrong term, but belief strength, for example. How much do you rely on this kind of proportion of these 2 numbers, and that they are going in a certain direction? Yeah, but I'm just wondering whether this could play a role. Thank you.
Brandon?
Yeah, so it kind of goes back to, I think, what Frank and Ron were talking about. I would argue that we're treating the order in which these 2 numbers appear as if that somehow flips the switch between schema consistent and schema inconsistent information. So imagine for a moment I'm a participant, I go into this study, I have a very strong impression that far more black men get shot than white men. I would argue that in wave 2, that's still schema inconsistent information, right? Even though the numbers have flipped, even though the crossover has happened, those 2 numbers are close enough that it's not really schema consistent at that point. That can potentially explain why this pattern is not doing what it does in the other one, right?
Right.
We're talking about schema consistency or inconsistency is if just getting the numbers in the right order switches the whole thing to schema consistency versus inconsistency. I don't think really that it's working that way. If I truly believe that there's a huge gulf between those 2 things, and then I see these numbers, that suggest that, no, there's not a huge gulf between those two things. That's not really consistency.
I agree with that point, that as a conceptual matter, as you said, the way we defined it has just been as a matter of which one is larger or smaller, but it's completely possible that their representation, despite the fact that that the separation, like the magnitude of the difference, despite the fact that it's in the same direction, yeah, I agree that people could also have that type of representation.
In other words, these data could be consistent with the hypothesis if there were a wave 4, 5, and 6.
Yeah, that's, I'm sorry,
Right,
that's,
yeah.
that's what we were
Right.
just.
It's going.
Sorry, we were just saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, everyone. Thank you for great questions and discussions, and thank you, Dr. Cornell, for great talks.
All right, thanks, everyone.